Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Maaser Sheni. We're up to Perek Hey Mishnah Tedvav, the final Mishnah of the Masechet. This Mishnah also appears in Masechet Sotah, chapter 9, Mishnah 10. It lists various decrees of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the first of which involves the Vidui Maaser. Now the Rav tells us Yochanan Kohen Gadol was the Kohen Gadol after Shimon HaTzadik, who had served at the beginning of the second Bet Mikdash era. The Mishnah begins, Yochanan Kohen Gadol he'evir hodayot ha'maaser. Yochanan Kohen Gadol brought an end to the recitation of Vidui Maaser. The Mefarshim explain, the Rav says, Ezra the scribe, punished the Leviim for not joining him when he went up to Eretz Yisrael from the Galut Bavel, the Babylonian exile. He decreed that Maaser Rishon should be given not to the Leviim, but should be given to the Kohanim. Therefore, it was no longer appropriate to say the Maaser confession because it includes the words V'gam netativ lalevi. I have given it, referring to Maaser Rishon, to the Levi. Now, from the time of Ezra Sofer until Yochanan Kohen Gadol, people still recited the Vidui Maaser because there are psukim, verses in the Torah where Kohanim are called Leviim. However, Yochanan Kohen Gadol argued that since the psukim discussed here, V'gam netativ lalevi, I have given it to the Levi, since they refer to a Levi specifically, the Vidui should not be said. This is how the Tiferet Yisrael explains it in Masechet Sotah, chapter 9, Mishnah 10. The Mishnah continues, Afu bitel et hamorarim. He also abolished the wakers, which was the practice of the Levim in the Bet Mikdash, to recite the psukim, Ura lama tishan Hashem, awaken, why do you sleep? Hashem, from Sefer Tehillim, chapter 44, pasuk 24. And the Mefarshim explained the Levim would stand on their platform in the Bet Mikdash each day and cry out the pasuk, Ura lama tishan Hashem. Yochanan put an end to this practice because there is no such thing as Hashem being asleep. How do you say Ura lama tishan Hashem? Now the pasuk refers to times of exile when Hashem seems to ignore our suffering and it appears as if he is asleep. But it was not proper for the Levim to recite this verse in the time of Yochanan when the Bet Mikdash was standing. Veta nokfim, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, he abolished the strikers, which is the practice in the Bet Mikdash to make a cut in an offering's head right before it was slaughtered. The Mefarshim explain, before an animal was slaughtered as a korban, as an offering, they would cut it between its horns, causing blood to run into its eyes. This would temporarily blind the calf and make it easier to restrain it for the shchita, for the slaughter. Yochanan abolished this practice because the wound looked like a disqualifying blemish, like a mum, and people might mistakenly think that a blemished animal is fit for the mizbeach. So instead, Yochanan Kohen Gadol installed large rings in the floor of the Bet Mikdash, of the temple, which would hold the animal's neck in place during the slaughter. Until his days, the hammer would bang in Yerushalayim during Chol HaMoed, meaning blacksmiths would work on Chol HaMoed, and he stopped them from doing so. Now the Mefarshim explained, the Rav says, although melacha, work is generally forbidden in Chol HaMoed, work needed to prevent a loss, which we know as davar ha'aved, is permitted. The blacksmiths that Mishnah mentions here were allowed to work on Chol HaMoed to prevent a loss, but Yochanan Kohen Gadol forbade them to work then because their hammering was very noisy and it brought disrespect to the Chag, to the festival. And in his days, it was not necessary for anyone to ask whether tithes had to be separated from demai, which is produce received from an amaretz. We know an amaretz is an unlearned person who is not careful in his observance of certain laws. Because the reason we wouldn't have to ask anymore whether tithes had to be separated from demai, because Yochanan Kohen Gadol decreed that tithes must always be separated from such produce. Now the Mefarshim explain, the Mishnah is referring to the rabbinic prohibition of eating demai before tithing it, like we mentioned in chapter 3, Mishnah 3. Now this decree was enacted by Yochanan Kohen Gadol and his court. Midoraita, according to biblical law, the Mefarshim explain, one is allowed to eat the produce of an amaretz without tithing it first. One does not have to be concerned that it might be tevel, because since most Amei Haaretz did tithe their produce, it can be assumed that the one you received it from did as well. Some people, however, they went beyond the letter of the law, Lifnei Mishurat Adin, and they avoid eating demai before asking the Amei Haaretz whether it had indeed been tithed. So when Yochanan became the Kohen Gadol, he made an investigation and he discovered that a significant minority of Ame'aretz separated only Terumah and not the other tithes from their produce, like the Gemara says in Masechet Sotah, page 48a. Now, although this did not affect the law Mideoraita, because the majority of Ame'aretz did separate all the necessary tithes, Yochanan and his court, Ubedino, they decreed that their produce is prohibited before it has been tithed. After the decree was passed, the Rav says, people stopped asking the Amaretz whether his produce has been tithed, because he may no longer be believed, and they would have to tithe it in any event, so there was no point in asking. Again, because Yochanan Kohen Gadol made an investigation, he discovered that a significant minority of Amaretz separated only Terumah and not the other tithes from their produce. Now, even though it's an effect in Midoraita, nevertheless, he decreed that their produce is asul before it has been tithed. And that is in Rabotai of Perikei Mishnat Tedvav, and that is in Rabotai of Mishnayot Masechet Maaser Sheni, Chazak u'Baruch Hadran Alach Masechet Maaser Sheni. Now we begin Rabotai Masechet Challah. Just as an introduction, the Torah says in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 15, Psukim 17 to 21, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe Lemor, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Daber el Bnei Yisrael v'marta alehem, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Bevoachem el haaretz asher ani mevi etchem shama, when you come to the land to which I am bringing you, Vayah ba'acholchem milechem haaretz terim terumah laHashem, and it shall be, when you eat from the bread of the land, you shall separate terumah from Hashem, for Hashem. Rishit arisotechem challah tarimu terumah, ki terumat goren ken tarimu otah. The first of your doughs, a loaf, you shall separate is terumah, like the terumah of your threshing floor, so shall you separate it. Merishit arisotechem titnu laHashem terumah ledorotechem. From the first of your doughs shall you give to Hashem terumah for your generations. So the Torah teaches that one who is preparing bread must separate a portion of the dough and give it to a Kohen. This portion is known as challah, which literally means a small loaf. Now, before we begin the Mishnah, just to share with you the merit of the mitzvah, the Gemara tells us in Masechet Shabbat, page 32b, that if people keep the challah obligation, their stored produce will be blessed, as the pasuk says in Yecheskel, chapter 44, pasuk 30, Vereshit arisotechem titnu lakohen laniach ba'acha el betecha. You shall give the first of your doughs to the Kohen so that a blessing will rest in your house. The reward corresponds midah keneged midah with the fulfillment of the mitzvah. By sanctifying a portion of the finished dough, he is rewarded with the blessing bestowed upon his finished produce. Now the Mishnah begins, just as an introduction, when one needs dough in order to make bread, he must separate a portion of the dough and give it to a Kohen. This portion is called challah. The Mishnah today is going to teach that only certain types of grain are subject to this obligation of challah. Chamisha dvarim chayevim b'challah. The following 5 types of grain are subject to the obligation of challah: hachitim, v'seorim, v'kusmin, v'shibolet, shual, v'shifon. Wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Dough made of any other type of grain is not subject to challah. So, for example, the Mefarshim explain, dough made of rice or millet flour is not subject to the challah obligation. This is learned from a pasuk that the Rav quotes. The Rav says we learn the obligation of challah from Pesach. It says by Pesach in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 16, pasuk 3, matzot lechem oni, v'ne'emar lechem bechallah, and it says those same word lechem by challah in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 15, pasuk 19, v'ya ba'acholchem milechem haaretz. So just like lechem by Pesach is speaking about dough that can become chametz, so too lechem by challah is speaking about dough that can become chametz. And we know only these 5 species of wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, only they have the ability to become chametz. Now, having taught that only these 5 grains are subject to the challah obligation, this Mishnah and the next Mishnah will we will do tomorrow, discuss a number of other halachot that apply only to these species. Here the Mishnah discusses the halakha of the new cup of grain chadash, which may not be eaten until the Omer offering is brought on the second day of Pesach, like the Torah tells us in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 23, Psukim 10 to 14. The Omer, the Korban Omer, is a mincha offering made from barley of the new crop. The barley for this offering was usually harvested on the night before the second day of Pesach. We will speak about it more in Mishnah Masechet Menachot, chapter 10, Mishnah 3. It is even prohibited, the Mefarshim say, to harvest the new crop of grain before the barley for the Omer offering is harvested. The prohibition to harvest the new grain before harvesting the barley for the Omer is learned out from the words of the Pasuk, which describe the Omer as Reshit Kitzilchem, the first of your harvest. Now, first the Mishnah is going to review the halachot just discussed and teach another halakha about challah. These species are all obligated in Challah, like we just learned. They join with one another to reach the minimum amount needed for the Challah obligation. Now we will learn B'Sat Hashem in Mishnah Daled, Mishnah 4, that if dough is made from less than 1 1/4 kav of flour, it is not subject to the obligation of Challah. The Mishnah here teaches that a dough that was needed with 1 1/4 kav of flour made from a combination of different types of the 5 species of grain is obligated in Challah. So for example, if the dough was made from wheat and spelt challah, challah must be separated. However, if part of the 1 1/4 kav of flour was made from a type of grain that is not one of the 5 species, for example, some of it was millet flour, there is no challah obligation. And we will discuss later on in Mishnah chapter 3, Mishnah 7, an exception. Now the Mefarshim say it should be noted that the law that all 5 species combined applies only when they were kneaded together as a single dough. However, if they were kneaded separately and afterwards were joined together, not all of the species combined. For example, wheat can combine with spelt, but not with barley, oats, or rye. We will discuss this in chapter 4, Mishnah 2. The Mishnah continues, V'asurin b'chadash milifnei Pesach. They are all subject to the prohibition of eating chadash before Pesach, meaning the new crop of any of these 5 species may not be eaten before Pesach. We learn from the pasuk that this prohibition applies to any of the 5 species of grain. It does not, however, apply to other types of grain like rice. Now, although the Mishnah seems to imply that the chadash prohibition applies only until Pesach, it actually extends until the 2nd day of the Chag when the Omer is brought. Indeed, this is going to be stated clearly in the next case of the Mishnah with regards to the prohibition of harvesting the grain. The Mishnah continues, and the new crop of any of the 5 species may not be harvested before the grain for the Omer offering is harvested. We also learned this from the Pasuk. The Mishnah explains now what's considered the new crop with regards to the prohibition of harvesting it before the Omer. If these species took root before the Omer was harvested, the Omer permits them for harvesting and eating, but if not, if they did not take root until after the harvesting of the Omer, they are forbidden until next year's Omer arrives, meaning they may not be harvested or eaten until the next year Omer is harvested. And the Mefarshim explain whether grain is considered chadash depends on when it took root. If it took root before the Omer was harvested, meaning before the night of the 2nd day of Pesach, it is considered part of the earlier year's crop. Therefore, it would be permitted to harvest such grain. However, grain that took root after the Omer was harvested is considered part of the following year's crop and is therefore chadash. Therefore, the owner must wait until the next year's Omer to harvest it. And again, this halakha is learned from a pasuk in the Torah. And that is in Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Again, chazak u'baruch on the completion of Mishnayot Masechet Maaser Sheni. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.